Before we get started, I'll just do a quick introduction. My name is Devin Lau. I am the Assistant Director for Yale Center Beijing. Yale Center Beijing was established in 2014 as a way to continue the centuries-long relationship between Yale and China. We've hosted hundreds of events ranging from history, philosophy, science, you name it, we've done it. And so we're especially glad today to have a topic of conversation that is near and dear to my heart and to Paul and to Zhao heart, of course. And so let's get started with quick introductions. I don't think Paul needs much introduction. He's been a loyal speaker at Yale Center Beijing and has visited in person before, but just because I know some of you guys are new here, so quick introduction. Paul Freedman, Professor Paul Freedman, is the Chester Tripp Professor of History at Yale University. His original foray into academia began with medieval Europe and especially in Spain and Catalan. It's from that interest that he developed an interest in talking about spices and the spice trade, which led him to write his first book on food, Out of the East, which was talking about the spice trade. And then he edited a volume called Food, A History of Taste, which I read as an undergrad in his course. And from there, he also wrote 10 Restaurants That Changed America, which we'll talk about today, as well as American Cuisine and how I got that way. And he also has a forthcoming book on why food matters, which obviously you guys are all here, so you guys know that food matters. And Zhao Yong, or Yong Zhao, is also joining us. He's the CEO and co-founder of Junzi in New Haven and in Manhattan, a very popular and successful fast casual Chinese. Would you say Northern Chinese or just Chinese?
It's fine.
Yeah. And they've been doing extremely well, even amidst the pandemic, with very creative ways of engaging their audience with social media and other things, and have had a tremendous amount of very positive publicity on the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Eater, et cetera, et cetera. Zhao Yong is a graduate of Peking University as well as the Yale School of Environmental Sciences now. And so we're also very lucky to have him here because a lot of our conversations tend to be kind of very academic in nature, but we also have somebody who is very much on the ground and practicing. So that's great. And so today is going to be a moderated discussion with Paul and with Zhao Yong. Before we get into the discussion, I will say, if you are willing and able to, please turn on your cameras if you can. It's always nice to be able to see who we're talking to. And so that would be appreciated if you're able to do that. So I'll just give you guys a minute. So what's going to happen is I'm going to have a moderated discussion with some questions for both Paul and Yong, and then we'll turn it over to open floor for people in the audience to ask questions as well after we get through some of those questions. Yeah, let's begin. So the impetus for this program, what happened was I think it was about 2 weeks ago, a dear friend of Paul's and Yong's, Cecilia Chiang, passed away at the age of 100. And she was obviously a legendary figure in the American culinary world, basically a who's who of chefs and food luminaries, all had marvelous things to say about her as she passed. And so I emailed Paul and said, oh my gosh, we've got to do something to commemorate her because, she's done so much to bridge the gap between US and China through food and through culture. And so that's sort of the impetus for this talk. And so Paul, you were very good friends with Cecilia. And in fact, you included her restaurant in your book, 10 Restaurants That Changed America. But of course, for those in China, they may not be as familiar with her. So maybe we could begin by, if we could have you give a brief introduction to who she was and kind of the impact of her life on cuisine in America, as well as the overall status of Chinese food and Chinese Americans in America.
Yes, thank you, Devin. I'm so glad to be with you and with Young. And this brings back some very happy memories of my stay in China in August of 2019, which on the one hand seems just like yesterday, and on the other, maybe half a lifetime ago. So I was very fortunate enough to meet Cecilia Chang 8 to 9 years ago. I was working on this book on 10 most important restaurants in the United States. And you have to include a Chinese restaurant because Americans since the 1880s who were not of Chinese origin fell in love with Chinese food in the late 19th century. There are now about 40,000 Chinese restaurants in the United States, which is more than KFC and McDonald's branches combined. So, we will, I think, be talking about the different permutations of what is called Chinese food in the United States, which is not always all that authentic. But the personality of Cecilia Chang is hard to convey without using cliches like life-affirming, energetic. So I came to San Francisco to interview her. And I had no connection to her before. She was 92 years old and actually told me over the telephone, "Oh, yes, I'll talk to you, but you better hurry. I'm 92 years old." And she was more energetic than I was. I had allowed a couple hours and then over 2 days and, very careful to pace her. And she never was tired. And I was kind of dragged out after just a couple hours. And she was so sparkling and lively. She asked me when I was coming back. She made arrangements for my wife to go to one of the most difficult to get a reservation places in the United States for her 60th birthday. And Cecilia came with us for the 60th birthday party. So anyway, just a sense of who she was. She was born Sun Yun. Her family was from Shanghai. They were wealthy owners of a number of enterprises in pre-revolutionary China, movie theaters, textile mills, among other things. She grew up in Beijing. She was one of 12 children, the 7th daughter. And, in a palatial kind of compound, they had 2 chefs, one who cooked Northern Chinese food and another who cooked Shanghai food. She never learned to cook because it wasn't appropriate for someone of her status to cook. She had a lot of adventures. She had a life of great adversity, fleeing the Japanese occupation of Beijing, and then settling in Japan after the revolution, and then almost by accident opened a restaurant in the United States. She had come to the United States in 1960 to be with her sister, one of her sisters who had lost her husband. And she met by chance some friends from China who convinced her to invest in opening a restaurant, a Chinese restaurant in San Francisco. And then they pulled out of it, and Cecilia was left with a large financial obligation. And she was ashamed to go back to Japan to tell her husband that she had wasted all this money, and opened up a restaurant under not very promising circumstances, being a woman in a male-dominated field, being Northern Chinese, and every other restaurateur in San Francisco was from Guangdong or Fujian, and then not even having a restaurant in Chinatown. It was in another neighborhood. Nevertheless, she made a tremendous success of it. She served food that was both more authentic than what was being served to non-Asian, non-Chinese Americans, but that was accessible. And she also was a great educator, telling people how to eat things, what to order, and this restaurant opened in 1961 and was called the Mandarin, and it would, if not revolutionize, at least change American appreciation of Chinese food. She remained very active in the restaurant world, both as an investor, as an experimenter, as a mentor to many restaurant owners, and a beloved and unique figure.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, and so, you know, Jiayong, you got to meet Cecilia, I think, through Paul, right? And
Yes.
and anyways, you know, you're following in her footsteps, and you're trying to bring a taste of Northern Chinese cuisine to the American public now. And of course, in her time, that was through fine dining. But the trend now in the food world overall is you know, fast casual and making it more accessible and for people to understand. So, what was your experience like with her, getting to meet her and work with her? And talk with her, especially since you're doing something that's very much, you know, very much a continuation of what she's done for Chinese food in America. And how have you been inspired by her?
Yeah, I mean, I first introduced by Paul to her in 2016 in January. I was in California, and Paul said, you have to go visit Cecilia. And to me, that's like, I need to visit a god. So I called her, and she picked the phone, and she speak, you know, Mandarin, like in a northern accent. So I speak like that as well. She said, okay, come to visit me. This is my address. And yeah, I'll see you. I forgot which day that was, but I'll see you then. I was like, wow, that was quick. And then I just visit her and just talk about our vision. I think she immediately like what we said, because what we were saying is essentially it's about, we think there's the development of Chinese food in America is lacking. There's a lot of more potential for Chinese food to be better. And we want to bring something different. We want to do something different. And I think she really appreciate, or say she react to one thing that we want to say is really well, is that we want to do a better management. She's not just say, oh, our culture is better. She's more like, she do things really, really well and really diligently. And she do anything that's almost like feel perfect. So that's like, you saw her, you saw a living legend. That means like from physical part, she is in that year, she's 16, so which means she's 97 and or 96, and her hair is all black and no dyes, right? And she's very active, exercise every day. She still cook herself, four dishes a day sort of things, and she'll buy groceries and just like all the things in 96, and she reply text messages and reply emails, all these things. Like, imagine your grandpa, like in the 70s, sometimes they don't do that, right? But she react to news like such as, oh, Prince is dead. Sorry, I mean, all these pop culture things, just react to those. So I was so impressed or like shocked by that, because that's like what the legend looks like. And I was also very lucky that when I visited San Francisco sometime for business, she allowed me to stay at her guest rooms. And then it's like, see all the like photos, all the events, all the things she was been through. It's like, wow, all these history just in front of me. And then she's like, feels like a person in the traditional, not traditional, but like in the Chinese wuxia kind of world. She's like the one who's such a kind of big master. She doesn't need learn the moves. She's like, any moves that kind of be great. So when I would stay at her home, she was cooking like fishes. And she put like a shower cap on top of a fish and put in the microwave, and then voila, it's a great steamed fish. And all these little tricks, she's playing very simple cooking, and all the dishes came so good. I was so lucky to have some dishes with her, cooking with her, jjiamian as well. And sometimes, so yeah, I was like so impressed by her about those simplicities. And she's very passionate, and she's also very, like, she treats people really well if she trusts you. And if you lost the trust, she's also doesn't give a shit, that sort of person. So you don't want to cross her. So yeah, that kind of person is like really, really kind of legend from this experience we have in close.
Yeah, and everybody that I've talked to that's known her personally is just, just always beaming with how energetic and lively and friendly she is. So that's great. And both of you guys touched about sort of the role that Cecilia had in changing Chinese cuisine in America. And so Paul, we can't really understand her impact and how groundbreaking her work was unless we think about the context in which she was stepping into. So could you talk a little bit about the history of Chinese cuisine in America, especially as it relates to how Chinese Americans have been perceived in the US and how food has, always been used as a tool for good and bad, whether it's for Chinese cuisine or other cuisines, from Asia or other ethnic foods in America. So, yeah.
Well, I think the starting point, as I said before, is the late 19th century. Americans liked to experiment with other people's foods. The three most popular cuisines that what might be called generic Americans patronized were Mexican, Chinese, and Italian. And these restaurants were originally opened for the immigrant community, but beginning with the same kind of urban young people who are, kind of have few ties, financial or familial, that tie them down and like to experiment. These are the first American patrons of foreign restaurants. And this was a development characteristic of the United States at least 100 years before most other countries. I mean, obviously now, everywhere you go, there's sushi and burritos and panini and pizza. But Americans were the first ones to experiment. That did not mean that was because Americans were particularly tolerant. The wild popularity of Chinese food coincides with harsh restrictions on immigration and discrimination against the Chinese who were already in the United States, barring them from all sorts of jobs and enterprises. So unfortunately, much as we'd like to believe that food is a bridge between peoples, it's not sufficient in itself. It's perfectly possible right now, today, for somebody to love Mexican food and to be all for building a wall to keep Mexican people out of the United States. So this phenomenon kind of characterized a lot of the relationship between Chinese restaurant owners and the public. The American public loved what they saw as exoticism of Chinese food. They liked certain kinds of flavors that were unavailable in the American or European food. But Chinese food had to be adjusted to American tastes. That meant, for example, that a lot of the sauces were like gravy. They were thicker. The stir-fried effect was for the vegetables, but then it would be covered with a kind of a thicker sauce. The American and English term stir-fried doesn't even exist until 1940. People who were not Chinese didn't really understand the principles of Chinese cuisine and the most basic kinds of aspects of cooking. So Americans were already not fond of organ meat or nether parts of animals. So things like chicken feet or tripe were not popular. A lot of dishes had bigger pieces of meat. The food was sweeter. What would be supposedly sweet and sour in America to this day really is just sweet, and forget the sour. So the restaurant owners knew how to make these adjustments. They cooked a cuisine that resembled that of where they came from. Most of them were from the Pearl River Delta. from, you know, more or less Xiamen and that part of Guangdong. Later, after the immigration laws were, the discriminatory laws were ended in 1965, most of the Chinese immigration, and particularly immigrants who went into the restaurant business, were from Fujian. The American attitude towards foreign food oscillates between a desire for more authentic. So Americans discover, you know, spaghetti and meatballs is not really Italian, or chop suey or chow mein is not really Chinese. But they don't really necessarily want the authentic, and Young can talk more with more expertise and experience than I can ever muster about this dynamic between you know, what Americans like, what they think they like, what they can be taught to like, and what they don't like. And this is also the way in which Cecilia Chang, other restaurateurs, opened restaurants that had a more regional or varied set of flavors. So not just Cantonese, but the other, many at least of the other regions of China. There was a vogue for Northern Chinese food. Probably the most successful was Sichuan food, Hunan. But these things also have their inauthentic qualities, and it's probably futile to distinguish absolutely between authentic and inauthentic. I've heard people say that Chinese American food is its own cuisine. It's just another kind of Chinese food, just like Chinese Peruvian food or Chinese Indian food. Certainly, there's been a consistent tension between the desire for authenticity, which is often reflected by regionalism, and the desire for things like General Tso's chicken, which is, you know, I mean, it was invented by someone from originally from Hunan, but you know, there's a wonderful scene in the movie, The Search for General Tso, which is a documentary really about not only this particularly odd and popular dish in the United States, but what it means to be a Chinese restaurateur in the US. And they have a scene, there's a museum, I understand, in Hunan for the real General Tso. And they interview people coming out and ask them about, do you know that General Tso is, there's a popular dish in the United States named after it, and everybody knows it. And most of them are angry and irritated about it. You know, how dare they? Or what the hell is this? So, you know, that's a kind of perfect epitome of the funnier aspect of American reception of Chinese food.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please, absolutely.
I think my perspective is different from Paul, because when I came to US when I was 21, so which means we came to first get in touch with Chinese food in America. The American Chinese food, like I was first reaction of, what the hell is this? It tastes so bad, right? And I was dying for looking for something more authentic. But grown in the years, I learned the history and learned all these different things about it. So we started to really understand the cuisines, especially from Paul's books. There's a kind of interesting framework I started putting thinking about Chinese food. So think about cultural loss in translation. So think about Chinese culture in China, the contents like say university level. So if you're a graduate from college or a professor from college, and you go to a place where only primary school is available, so you have to teach the kids in 5 years old about what to learn in a university, and then everything you want to teach is going to be different. Like the way the teaching is going to learn from what they can learn from what they can hear from you, the word they know, the vocabulary they know. So the fundamental flavors for the people, no matter, they don't need any acquired taste, we call it, like such as in Chinese food. Like if a kid wants to taste some sugar, no matter how little he is, he can love it. Sugar, fat, salt, those flavors, kind of savory is kind of a non-acquisition acquired needed kind of flavors. Those are flavor can translate much easier across the world, no matter what kind of cuisine you are. And the shape, if you look at the shapes, the shape of popular in America, those shapes are the symmetric shapes, like pizza, salad, burritos, wraps, all these things, burgers, they look very simple and easy to understand. You can see what's inside and also simple ingredients. So those are kind of a perfect, what we kind of call the primary school level of food. Simple flavors and simple way of eating. No matter where you go, those are food are easy to translate. For Chinese food, because so much thing we have right now in from our knowledge in this audience, understand Chinese food most like university level, and then when you talk about Chinese food, it's totally different from a perspective of different audience in different countries. The same thing happened to culture come to China as well. Like if most people learn like Indian food, they probably only know curry or some like the pancakes, faping or something like that. But they don't know like the nuances or the detail from the northern, southern. They don't have the bandwidth of communication. Then if we look at the bandwidth of communication, that's a key of cultural communication. You always start from little and you start earning more and more bandwidth. So Italian cuisine earn those bandwidth from meatballs, but then when the country get richer, and then there's a cultural leader start to expand the bandwidth communication. But like happened at the same time for Japanese cuisine as well, right? Because sushi, what Cecilia once mentioned, when she was in Japan in the 60s, there was no Japanese cuisine at all. All the food is like post Second World War is like the low quality because Japan was very poor, kind of rebuilding themselves. So, and then out of 40 years, all the Japanese cuisine becomes such high-end stuff because Japanese like a lifestyle become more attractive. The same thing happened right now to Chinese culture as well. So like what we've seen from like past 10 years about Chinese product changed so significantly. Like there's so much better stuff right now happening in China, like in the world, because people don't know, but when they know it, understand it, have a bandwidth and learn from it, they'll be like, wow, this is awesome. That's gonna happen. So from our vision is, we want to establish brands, establish kind of frameworks of communication, stories, narratives to be able to expand these narratives so that we can tell stories. But you cannot just think about, okay, I'm going to really tell high school level story to primary school level, because you can do the kind of a graduation step-by-step things. So that's kind of how we think every step we're taking from our food design, the product design, branding design, it's based on the principles, understand the audience, at their level, understand your Chinese culture, and do a little bit of education, but don't do too much, but utilize that kind of knowledge to our advantage to bring food better, experience better. So far, like from the Juicy Kitchen or Nice Day Chinese, we have 2 brands right now. All of them is kind of probably highest reviewed Chinese restaurant brands in the US. Because in the US market, Chinese food usually be considered as a cheap, low quality, like just no design, dirty kind of food. So it's almost everything's like in the worse than 沙县小吃 level in China, just that kind of level. But it's very accessible. Everybody knows it. Everybody learn how, understand how to eat it. So if you kind of think about this perspective of food as vocabulary, like Japanese food has sushi, right? You learn this word and learn the food. So Chinese food is one of the largest vocabulary of food in the US about ethnic food. So like Italian food, Japanese food has those kind of large vocabulary. Like Chinese has a huge vocabularies. People learn like wonton, stir fry, wok, dumplings, all these things about it. But in the meantime, compared to what the real Chinese food potential can be, it's like only represent like less than 5% or something. There's so much more. So that's kind of difference is where the real gap is, also where the real potential is. That's what we're passionate about, kind of establish a new model for Chinese food to be able to make Chinese food independent from the immigrants who flee from China because of poverty. Because right now, China basically limited poverty. So there are no more immigrants go out of China to cook Chinese food anymore. So we have to kind of revise Chinese food from a immigrant cooking Chinese food into a McDonald's kind of level of, you don't need Americans to go out of America to cook McDonald's. You just hire local people, but your brand is, the culture is about American culture. So we want to establish what you mean by international Chinese food culture. It's going to be different from the Chinese culture, food culture in China, because there's so much gap. But you're going to establish a new textbook for the primary school level education of Chinese food. That's kind of what we're trying to do.
That's amazing. I mean, there's so much that we can talk about there. I guess one real quick question, if you can just give me like a sentence answer. Where do you think Americans are now in terms of what level are we eating at? Are people eating still at an elementary school level, or are we like, have people finally graduated to high school?
No,
and of course you're in New York City, so it's, it's different than the rest of the country too.
So if you can think about this, right? Like Singapore, those kind of general Chinese kind of societies, those are like high school level or like a senior high school level. If you go to Chinatown, in a well-developed immigrants kind of crowd, such as Flushing, New York, like LA, those can be like middle school level. And most of Park America is like elementary school level or even just first grade level, because there was a research done by Panda Express before. The Panda Express, one of the iconic Chinese food brand in US selling basically Swiss hour chickens, those stuff. So in the middle America, like where most like in the Trump supporter part of America, the red countries, right? They're culturally relatively less traveled. So they think Panda Express is authentic Chinese food. But in the West Coast, East Coast, where those kind of blue states, liberal people, right? They are more economically have more advantages and they travel more, have more cultural communication. They think Panda is not authentic. So because there are more immigrants, also they learn the word more. So that's what they think the difference between different part of the world. So you see a lot of brand in China, like Yun Hai Yao, those kind of brand in Singapore was pretty successful, and also a lot of brand in like Japan is kind of successful because it be more authentic. But the same level of authenticity come to the US probably not going to be authentic because nobody understands it. So that's the differences.
So you have two very large and complicated countries exchanging cultures. So obviously there's going to be a lot of room for difference there. Paul, we were talking about regionalism and region specific foods, and we see in places like New York where it's almost a fad where you have to collect as many of these hyper regional restaurants. I've been to that place. Oh, have you tried this dish? And there's this sort of obsession with collecting these exotic restaurants and foods. And so, on the one hand, that's great that people are branching out and they're able to sort of understand more about the intricacies of different cuisines. But, on the other hand, it plays right back into these, stereotypes of exotification and, this idea of perpetual otherness, right? Where, if you're eating this food, you're never part of America. You're this weird other culture. So can you talk more about this exotification and objectification of food and how that sort of plays into how race relations works out in America?
Yeah, it's that it's not only a search for authenticity, but a worry about it's a competition with other people. So it's not just I, as a food adventurer, have found a place that serves, the cuisine of Yunnan, or Manchuria and Dongbao cuisine, but that I was the only person who didn't speak Chinese, or there were no tourists, or oh, that place that you go to, that Taiwanese restaurant, that's nobody goes there anymore. That's spoiled. Investment bankers go there, right? That's a mark of people from the suburbs go there. That's a mark of it being ruined. So that kind of competitiveness means that restaurants get points for otherness, and sometimes they manipulate this. For a while, the chain, a very successful little chain called Xi'an Famous Foods, that had, Western Chinese food, particularly noodles, made a point of hiring cashiers at its places where you just took out food, stands, cashiers who didn't speak English, except that they could understand numbers, because numbers are really important, because that was more authentic. I mean, they could have found people who spoke English, but the little inconveniences of negotiating would be better, would be a mark of authenticity. Or there's Salvadorian food stands that served the sort of iconic dish of Salvador, which is it pupusa? Is that what it's called, Devin? Right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's sort of a burrito-like turnover-like thing. And she was interviewed by an anthropologist or an ethnographer or a food expert, and she said, back home in Salvador, these would not, these would just be meat or beans, not vegetables. Never put vegetables in it. But blanquitos like vegetables. Blanquitos, the Spanish diminutive term for white people. White people like vegetables, so what the hell? But the fact that she didn't really speak English, that she has a food stand, that it's in Red Hook, a neighborhood that was at the time dicey, difficult to get to, slightly dangerous, made the food authentic. So yeah, there is a comical but unpleasant side to a lot of this. And now there's a sort of a discovery on the part of a lot of readers of the New Yorker or, sophisticated urbanites that, oh my gosh, there is this sort of process of othering the immigrant, or of it's, I mean, it's kind of like a discovery of something that's always been there. So maybe better late than never.
I think the term they use now is called Columbusing.
Okay, yeah. See, I'm just slow. Yeah, that you discover something that was already there.
That's always been there. Exactly.
Right. But I think the only non-Columbus aspect is that the people who were there actually, in this case, arranged things for you. The agency of the restaurateur has been, until recently, underestimated. These things were not just selected by the generic American audience. They were proposed by restaurateurs who invented certain things, just like the Japanese invented the California roll, which has no raw fish, in order to introduce sushi to squeamish Americans.
Right.
Devin can add to that as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Yon.
Well, because our business is trying to do something larger scale. So when you look at the numbers in the US, about 46,000 Chinese restaurants in the US, there's about $30 billion market every year, which means every Americans every year, they can eat $100 worth of Chinese food. Like 70% of them will eat Chinese food at least once a month. So the majority part of Chinese food they're eating, they're like cheap containers and from just immigrant families. These are the majority part of the face of images of Chinese culture, food, and people. And that's why when when coronavirus happens, when people say China virus, and the Chinese restaurant just have huge dip in their sales, because people just feel, well, Chinese people there is like they're dangerous because we don't understand them, all these different understanding. But in the city, it's a bit different, because when there's a mega city like New York, the cultural elites will have a totally different kind of taste and sophisticated kind of nuanced understanding of culture and food. And that part is so different from the countryside America, almost like feel like two totally different countries. The other country, they don't care anything. They don't give any details. They don't have any nuances. But in the city, like the more unique you are, the better. But then there could be two different kind of reality for the restaurant to think. They're gonna cultural leaders want to do something unique in New York, but those things will never travel in the U.S. as a kind of majority part of the U.S. So that's what we'll come back to, this kind of bandwidth kind of theories. So we imagine if we can open 3,000, 5,000 locations, and then every year every restaurant, there's at least like $100 per person kind of purchase to serve, every restaurant serve like 10,000 people, Americans. That will be the most important kind of direct contact of cultural communication of Chinese food and culture in the future, because there's no kind of national level communication be easy to do right now, because all the contention between the government and politics. And the other kind of form of communication is hard to do because clothing, housing, traveling, all these things is so higher, much higher cost than just grab a food for Chinese takeout. So from that perspective, the understanding of kind of open the bandwidth to kind of sometimes inherit these kind of stereotypical thought about it, to create first like easy entry for them, and then start to pivot on the stories, can develop the stories, the narratives. Oh, by the way, like you thought there's all the story, but I will tell the second chapter. Oh, there's like 10 other chapters for people to get interested about it. That's very important. So that's kind of one thing we've been trying to develop about the narrative expansions. I think what's Cecilia been doing from the beginning is, in those era, her work is kind of very important, groundbreaking, because change the narratives of the bandwidth that people want to give to Chinese food. Because before that, Chinese food was just those, you know, strange kind of chop suey stuff that only the bohemians will go, urban, like the hipster will go. And the Cecilia just changed the image of that. And those places changed the image from the dirty places. Cecilia said, like, the people serving the food was like that there's something in the soup, because they don't care, right? Everybody's go to Chinese restaurant, they will know those servers serve their food, some in their soup, because that's what you're gonna experience about those, like in China called the Canguans, or like those are dirty places you go to for something exotic experiences. But Cecilia just make a very decent, like, wow, like a real decent, real restaurant. So that's kind of one thing to change it. It's almost feel like there's one people come in China make like the famous Michelin star Shaxian fine dining place. And for people, oh my God, I never heard of that, but I'm convinced because of one revolutionary figure. So that's like how things change.
So that's, I mean, so we're really talking about two kind of different areas, right? One is sort of this idea of like Americanized Chinese food, that's like the comfort food, right? And you guys have both mentioned that actually it's the most popular kind of type of restaurant in America. And then we're also talking about sort of fine dining and sort of pushing sort of cultural elites or global elites, whatever you want to call them, to you know, understand more and experience more of this. Sorry, wait for this siren to go by. So
we can hear you.
Okay, all right. So so I guess I want to talk a little bit about this idea of fine dining and food criticism and restaurant guides. You know, it's interesting because, you know, in the US, in say California, the Michelin guide decided, you know, we can't give out a guide this year because of the pandemic. But actually last month in Shanghai, they just came out with a new Michelin guide. You know, and ever since the Michelin guide has come out in China, maybe I think about 3 years ago, you know, everybody's obsessed with hunting stars, and I guess that's a worldwide phenomenon. But you know, and the restaurants are obsessed with kind of trying to obtain these stars. At the same time, you have a lot of people on the web saying like, wait a minute, like what kind of list is this? Like no Chinese person thinks any of these restaurants are like the best in the city, right? So there's this kind of tension with the way you have, that's a result of these conflicting tastes as a result of this global elite culture. So Paul, we've talked a lot about Michelin guides and restaurant rankings and things like that in the past, but I think people in China perhaps are a little less familiar with it. So do you want to just sort of lay on the table sort of all the different kind of thoughts that are out there, and also, you know, especially how it relates to this Chinese market that's emerging?
The Michelin guide from years and years was just France, and maybe extended a little bit to Belgium, to Italy. It worked well when there was sort of one dominant cuisine. So I have a 1965 Michelin guide for France. And if you look at Paris alone, there are about 270 restaurants, and 258 of them are French. I mean, they don't say French restaurant, and there's some variation. Some have Alsatian food, some have more Mediterranean Provençal food, but there's one Chinese restaurant, maybe two North African, Vietnamese place, because at that time, French people went to French restaurants, and that was the whole point of being French. So the same in Italy. You can do a ranking very effectively if everybody is serving more or less a dossier of dishes, even if the dossier is very large. The judgment of stars is then, between the same category of items. When Michelin came to New York, there has never been a cult of Michelin stars in New York. I think Jan can correct me if I'm wrong, but having a Michelin star is great, but it's not a guarantee of success, and neither is a demotion. In the way that in France, and Bernard de Loiseau committed suicide when he was demoted from 3 to 2 stars. And it's very hard to judge in a eclectic world, or in a place like Shanghai that has so many different restaurants and cuisines, and in which Michelin is ranking, if I'm correct, French and Italian restaurants, the same kind of gamut of international foods. And so in a way, it surprises me that Michelin should be regarded as validating the greatness of restaurants. On the other hand, perhaps it is still a symptom of relying on, or perhaps over-respecting, the judgment of outsiders. There are plenty of Chinese restaurant reviewers, right? There are plenty of newspapers and magazines that review restaurants. There are plenty of professional reviewers. There are plenty of opinions of amateurs available over the internet. Certainly, one of the effects of the pandemic in the United States is an erosion of fine dining that I think is going to have some long-term consequences. And hence, some of this fussing about rankings may also diminish along with it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Young, you're in the business, and you guys have gotten lots of great publicity from New York Times and Wall Street Journal and all these places, social media, etc. So how do you sort of navigate this tension between getting this very positive review, but also trying to appeal to the mass market, but then also you want to be authentic and create food that is true to your own identity. So what has that been like, trying to navigate all those things?
So, I mean, publicity is kind of a result of understanding the social narratives. The narratives is very interesting because it's like one society is a kind of bonded through like the main theme of the societies. So sometimes the conflicts of different civilizations, because the narratives are quite different, you cannot really talk to each other. Like the Chinese, the Western world or Islamic world, that all have different narratives, that have their total different way of writing. And then as us, like when we're trying to establish a new brand, to understand how can we learn both the language, trying to write something that can be read, appreciated through this audience, is a very, very important. So as an example of the Michelin guide, those are like a perspective of cultural dominance, because they're from the people who think their opinions matters for some food, like French people, right? Then there's some people going to be responsible for music, and there's like American call their own, the champion of a national sports league, a world champions. That's weird, because what do you mean by world, right? It's almost feel like the world xiangsheng champions, like that's of course going to be in Chinese, like nobody else speak that. But maybe 20 years, 30 years later, they're going to be all kind of people from different countries speak Chinese using xiangsheng as one of the form of communication, comedian part of a performance, just because China's economic influences and political influences, cultural influence become larger and larger. And then eventually the same thing could happen, have the same conversation at some point, like, oh, our own comedy is like, why we need to use judgment from Chinese, right? All these things happen again, because of this kind of cultural differences, a narrative different, clash and the conflicts, but also merging with these conflict narratives. So as a Chinese brand right now, if you look at this year's New York Times, there's not really much of a positive reporting on Chinese, anything about China. So we got the whole page of positive story about a Chinese restaurant and the efforts we're trying to do something, because that story is consistent with their stories they want to talk about. It's different from the story that other Chinese part of, especially the national part of the national clash of the US to China. It's different from the government. So you can design the food as kind of a non-political kind of way to talk about food, especially on the local communities. So there's one more thing that's very important for the Chinese culture in America. So I think we're into the new era of Chinese culture in America, because there was an era that China was very weak. So the people who live in the US will feel they're richer, they have better kind of stage than the Chinese people in their motherland. But in the meantime, they're not a majority in the American society. They're kind of a minority there, but they're still living in a better condition. And then in the most recent 20 years of development, economic changes, there's more and more rich kids or rich people go to America, although they're culturally very different, but they don't feel oh, I'm from poorer places. They're very confident. So the kind of American Chinese or Chinese American community feel that kind of pressure, because there's a kind of cousin from faraway land that's actually doing better than me, more powerful, more important. So this kind of squeeze, that's kind of when Junzi was emerged, because of kind of wave of thought of, oh, we bring the real Chinese culture here. And we think that's better, that's pure. And the American Chinese culture is kind of, is inauthentic, it's bastardized. But after years, the kind of development of change of the new generation of the second and third generation the immigrants, and they still have a second thought. So I probably don't know if in China people watch the movie about the Crazy Rich Asians, because in China people react poorly about that movie. So it looks very cliched and weird. But Americans, like those like Asian Chinese American can receive that kind of movies narratives very important, because they think that's their utopia. They think there is kind of almost like Black Panther, kind of there is Wakanda of Chinese-ness in Singapore. Because in China, that's too hard to accept. That's too big. But Singapore is kind of ideal, economically rich, but also kind of affluential, the way of rich cultures. A lot of people look at similar. So right now, because US-China has this kind of trend of this separation, the past is a kind of honeymoon of this 10 years of collaboration. I think next 10 years is going to be more on the kind of rivalries, competition. So I think the Chinese American culture will have a renaissance of identify themselves as a kind of a authentic, modernized culture. They're going to be contributing to the brand. So Nice Day Chinese, our new brand, is actually, the narrative is fully about that authentic, new generation American Chinese culture. So that's kind of how to build narratives. So that's why, because it's very localized, and we talk about helping the local people from the heritage of the immigrants' cultures. So that's all fits in the whole progressive agenda of on life side American politics. So then you get all these publicities because of that. Also, of course, all the interesting kind of topics of innovation part as well. But it's very important to write a kind of your chapter, kind of understanding the whole books. So that's why sometimes you look at the way of communication, and a lot of national media want to communicate content to talk about China in the US content. It's just so hard to talk about, because when you talk about it, it's in the wrong language.
Great. All right. So, I mean, I could talk about food with you and culture with you guys all day, and we have in the past. So let's open it up for some questions from the audience. I'd love to hear what other people are thinking about and what they have questions about. So there are two ways to do this. You can either type out your question in the chat box on the bottom of the Zoom chat function. We can all see it, and then I'll help facilitate those. Or you can directly just raise your hand, and I will be happy to call on you and unmute you. We have a nice size group, so we should be able to get a good conversation going. So if anybody has questions, go ahead and just raise your hand or type it out in the chat box, and I'd be happy to help facilitate that. And I know it takes people a while to warm up sometimes. All right, we've got our first question from Edna. Okay, so I'm going to unmute you. Hi, Edna, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So, like when I was visiting like New York and LA, I found a curious phenomenon like Chinese restaurants like in Chinatowns, they actually like their food are actually much more expensive than like US food. And like, what do you guys think would be a reason for that? Because like when I stay in Durham, like the Chinese food restaurant is basically like the same with US food, but like in like New York, it's like much more expensive, like $50 or $70 for one dish. Yeah, and especially like Sichuan food, I guess it's like more popular in the US.
Yeah. So there are two. Yeah, Paul,
go ahead. No, you know the answer to this.
So there are two kind of Chinese restaurants in Chinatown. So one for the locals. So they're very cheap. Those restaurants are really, really cheap. It's very hard to find, but there's for the locals. And then there's a restaurant for the tourists who just go to New York, want to do something, go to Chinatown, famous for some dishes that can, they're gonna basically pay more than they need to. So that's a very touristy. And then we go to neighborhood restaurants in all of America, then that's kind of where the local pay for their daily budget as a daily restaurant. So one important thing about Chinese food is the most common user scenario for Chinese food is when you don't want to cook, you just grab something from Chinese restaurant and take out or just deliveries. Before there's a third party, Uber Eats, the Chinese food is the OG delivery-based food. So those are like, if you look at all these television shows on America, a lot of those scenes, you can see a bunch of Chinese takeout boxes, like Big Bang Theory, all these things have it. So those are where people eat Chinese food. It's very common, very casual. It's nothing too fancy. It's not like you go Chinese food for like fine dining or anything. People don't think that way. But in Chinatown, then you go to China for something exotic, something interesting. That's almost like a tourist. You go theme parks, you go Disneyland, you pay something overpriced. Same thing.
Yeah, I think that's no. I think Yang has answered it.
And I think it's also important to note that in many places in the U.S., Chinatowns don't act like that's not where Chinese people live anymore. Like they've gone out into the suburbs, and so Chinatown is also not representative of what the actual Chinese population is eating either.
Yeah, I want to add just one more story about Chinatown. So I learned like the San Francisco China is one of the early Chinatown before. So I think in the beginning of the 20th centuries, the China was destroyed by earthquake or some fires. And then so the current, at the moment, the government, the white government want to remove Chinatown to move to outside the city, like they did for Japanese towns. And then they struck a deal with the leaders, the community leaders of the Chinese people, that the Chinese people almost feel, okay, now let's build the Chinatown to what you think that they should be. And then we can perform like Chinese people in Chinatown. So you can draw a lot of tourists to Chinatowns. So almost feel like the Chinatown is like theme parks, almost like immigrants of Chinese people is living in the theme park as a model minority, as a people you supposed to behave like this. So that's kind of there's a lot of much deeper conversation about those kind of model minority part, stereotype of Chinese people. But in the beginning, a lot of part of the minorities things like that. But in China, it happened too, right? A lot of minorities, they have to live in the tourist zones to perform like these rituals every day, like, you probably only celebrate once a year, but now you're going to do it every day. Almost like I need to do my spring festival every day because I'm minorities. So that's kind of a part of being minority in America.
Thanks. All right, so Dennis from the chat box has a question about, I'm going to expand his question a little bit. His question is, if we keep calling it the China virus, how does that affect Chinese food and restaurants? And of course it does. But let's talk more broadly about sort of xenophobia and racism and stereotypes and how that has historically always impacted a lot of Chinese food and ethnic foods.
Yep.
Ethnic foods.
Yep.
And then, yeah, so Paul, do you want to kind of take that real quick?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't exaggerate the use of the term China virus. This is a Trump topos, but it's not what you were describing in March and April, this sort of association of the COVID-19 virus with China, I think has diminished, particularly as it's obvious that the United States has not dealt with it all that well, in contrast to other countries. So the larger question, the answer, I think, is no, it's not going to affect the reputation of Chinese food. As Yang has emphasized, a lot of cuisines' reputations depend on the mother country and perception of the mother country. So it was possible once Italy became, rather than a source of a lot of poor people, and a war-devastated country, but rather the home of fashion and style, then Italian food becomes more popular. So I think there's always going to be a way in which the restaurant patron feels themselves to be superior, and there's a more harmful form of that. And a sort of customer is always right. If you own a business, you have to flatter your customer into thinking, this is the same as a clothing store, that they have taste and style when, often they don't. And it's not manipulating them, it's simply serving them or directing them, steering them away from things that are a mistake, or educating them. And you have to have a certain mentality for that. And a certain willingness to put up with a fair amount of nonsense. I think that the genius of Yang and his partners has been to have fun while acknowledging the struggle and celebrating the ability to educate even those people in the red states are capable of one of the big changes actually that I've seen in the United States in the last 20 years is I've been to places like Amarillo, Texas, or Columbus, Ohio. I lived in Nashville, Tennessee for a number of years. The food in these places is so much better. Not usually the Chinese food yet, but just regular, nice restaurant, more or less American food. The ingredients are better, the variety is greater, the attention to how things are prepared, and the enthusiasm of the clientele is greater. So there is some potential, I think, apart from questions of minorities.
Has your business been affected at all by COVID, and how
so there's a few data I can share. First of all, very recent research is still unpublished research done by a professor from NYU, study about the health department, the fail rate of restaurant in the health department. This year, a significant growth on the Asian restaurant, not only just Chinese. Asian restaurant has like 200% growth on the failure rate of the restaurant. There could be a discrimination case against that because nothing changed for the
In other words, they fail the test.
Yeah.
They fail the inspection.
Yeah, the inspector will be hard on them, or another way to think about it.
Right.
So there's a data shows the beginning of the pandemic, there's definitely a drop of demands on Chinese food because people have a gross fear of the people talk about China virus. And the same thing, like almost feel like people don't like the Corona beers because of coronavirus. That's so stupid, but that's sometimes you have the kind of associations. But Chinese food actually has a growing demand when pandemic actually happened, because when actually happened, the whole lockdown of American society just make the food or the kind of user scenario of food is like there are no restaurant opens, so you're gonna depend on deliveries. What we're gonna do with the delivery food? Chinese food. So there's a huge change from there's a kind of recent report talk about nobody want to buy salad anymore. People buy more pizza or more Chinese. The most frequent question people ask during the election is like where to find Chinese food, because it's very much a comfort food people need it at home. So there's kind of a change over this dynamic, because the utility value of Chinese food as a delivery-based comfort food kind of dominated more than the cultural fear. So that's kind of one thing that's good. But the fundamental, there is a reason that Americans will be easier to kind of have a fear to Chinese food, because the restaurant operation sometimes have a questionable actions. So most Chinese foods operate by small families, and their restaurant haven't any renovation for 30 years. If you get into the restaurant, it looks very dirty, old, everything's just it's around. It's very hard to see this like a clean restaurant. And then when something happens, when people just even make up stories, there's rats in your restaurant, people can believe in it because that looks like potentially can happen easily. So those image stereotypes need to be changed. Like think about Japanese restaurant as well. If you think about Japanese restaurant, you usually think about cleanness, because you think, oh, the stereotype of Japanese people is like they're super clean. They're even like obsessed with cleanness. Right? All the story tell about is that, but none of the things tell the Chinese people doing that. So that's why the virus happens. We're in a disadvantage.
Right.
So we need to change that.
Right. All right. Jiaqi?
Right. So I actually got a question specifically for Yung. Yung, I was just checking out your amazing restaurants webpage, and something I realized is actually your menu's design is actually quite similar to Hawaiian poke in some degree. And just like you said earlier, I personally wouldn't call your like the food served in your restaurant like 100% pure Chinese and all that. And we have seen like the Hawaiian poke gain a very huge success in the States, like in some way because they're easier way to obtain vegetarian food, and they're very healthy. So I was wondering, have you guys considered that into when you guys develop your menu in the first place?
So the idea.
Sorry, like I'm very interested in how you guys like build the menu and how you guys decide on what kind of style you want to offer. Like,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So as I said, the foundation of the whole venture we're having is based on the future that there are going to be no Chinese people in the Chinese restaurants. So imagine that kind of scenarios, we're going to reverse the process from a Americanization of a Chinese family making Chinese food to a Chinesefication of American people make like American restaurants. So like you think about, we acquire a poke or acquire a Chipotle, those like an American restaurant, and we'll give them totally different handbook. The same employees, American employees, do a different handbook and make a Chinese food flavors that Chinese people will taste and, oh, that's a real flavors. So that's what you imagine kind of the Chinese food. Because in a way, is one thing that's important for Chinese culture is the authenticity is a temporary term, because they're going to be invented at some point, right? Like we talk about Sichuan food was invented by some point in the Qing dynasty. It's very recent. It's different from Sichuan food like 1,000 years ago. So which means there's no 100% authenticity when your culture is still living and breathing. So we imagine Chinese food like 20 years from now, there's going to be a lot of kind of this assembly line based type of serving as a kind of way of serving, but then they serve those Chinese flavors. So for example, what we have is actually, we inspired by my dining hall in Beijing University. those like trimming places, those like the tomato egg noodle places, they basically just same assembly line. You choose some noodles and put some sauce on it, put some vegetable, whatever meat you want it, and then you get your noodles and get your wraps. So same thing like a Chipotle. So that's why we think the model is very, very similar. There's no like American form, because form is very neutral. The flavor, the narratives, the story behind it is almost a culture. So we think this Jin's Kitchen is a new Chinese food, but it is Chinese food overall. So that's one, but also that provide a simplicity of operation that make American restaurateur be able to operate it. But now we're getting more professional so that we can get the nice day works. That's a totally new institution of works of restaurant management. But there's the details. We can talk later about that.
All right. We've got a very wide range of questions today. I guess it's a very wide-ranging conversation. Diane, can I unmute you so you can explain your question?
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing all these interesting stuff. So I'm just curious, when Yang mentioned about sort of having new generations of Chinese immigrants and sort of coming in with a lot more confidence and coming over and sort of revamp the identity of Asian American, like at large, starting from Chinese Americans, third generation, fourth generation, so on Americans. And I just, given my undergrad experience in the States, like living and breathing the liberal America, like this idea of collectivism of Asian Pacific Islander diaspora is so strong, and they want to sort of merge into each other and sharing cultures and be like a collective force for bargain of influence in the States. And I just feel like your ideas of influence from new immigrants is cool, but I feel like it's not going to happen the way that you want it to happen. Just want to have more conversation with that.
That's a great question. I mean, because the kind of associate board members of the Museum of Chinese America. So when we talk about this future of this vision of this museum, is like people always kind of argue a little bit about what's our identities. The Chinese in America, is it different from a Thai people in America? Is it different from like Korean in America? Is it different from Chinese in Mars? So, because this kind of actually geopolitically is kind of two of the largest due to geopolitical power, and that's the people in another country. It's quite different. So I think eventually those gravity of the motherland of culture and the influences will eventually differentiate Chinese immigrants a little bit from other kind of Asian or East Asian Pacific Islander kind of identities that American want group them in. There definitely going to be an alliance going to happen. But in the meantime, there are going to be a difference from these identities can happen as well. So, but not right now, because we're talking about every cultural movement has a 10-year of lagging from what's happening economically, social, politically. So, and I think in 5 years from now, there's those potential effects can have more and more impact. But I mean, what current generation being through is almost like the influence in the 2000 that at that moment. That's a projection.
Paul, question for you about MSG, and are there any reliable studies at all about the health impact of MSG?
That I don't know the answer to, I'm afraid.
As far as I know, there is no reliable study that says MSG has a negative effect. As a matter of fact, only time people complain about MSG is when it's in Chinese food. They never complain about it, even though it's in Lay's potato chips and Doritos, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, seems like a similar thing that we've been seeing.
Yeah, it's the same.
And it's a very venerable scare. It goes back to the 1960s.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's see. Jean, I'm going to unmute you and have you ask your question.
Hi, thank you for your insightful conversation. And you talk about authenticity. I think it's a very important term or vocabulary in the realm of food. So actually, it's quite complicated to discuss about, because when we're talking about authenticity, when we Chinese food go to America, there should be some adjustment to them. So obviously, what Chinese food is not Chinese food to Chinese. When the Chinese restaurant want to survive in the context of America, so there will be some change to accommodate America. So maybe we cannot call it authentic anymore if in the perspective of Chinese. But the thing is that how can we grasp the bad trade-off? How can we make a very appropriate point to meet both the authentic and while taking consideration to the taste of the localized people? Would you guys can give me some of your ideas? Thank you.
I think that you can't achieve perfect authenticity, partly because the ingredients are not there, partly because you're not in the same country, and the atmosphere is not the same. This is like, it's very hard to reproduce the feeling of a religious painting in a museum. Because, you know, it's been taken out of its temple or its church or whatever its original context was. But then again, you could say, well, you know, this was done in 1200 AD and we're not in 1200 AD anymore. You know, the world doesn't smell the same. It doesn't look the same. We don't have the same set of assumptions. So once you say that you can't have authenticity, that of course doesn't mean to say that bad ingredients are fine. So I think one can still make judgments of food that's better or worse, depending on the ingredients or on the skill, or bigger questions. A lot of the Chinese restaurants in the middle of America have tended to be buffets. And that's partly because it's easier for people who don't speak English very well. They don't have to explain things on the menu. People can just see them. And it also, Americans love choice, but it's not really very good for the food to sit around. So, you know, that it's okay to critique that. And an answer is not just, oh, well, you know, you're just hung up on authenticity. So the fact that there is no perfect authenticity doesn't mean that there isn't good and there isn't bad food. It's all cuisines are admixtures of influences from elsewhere. And as Yang said, any breathing culture is going to be changing. But the inauthentic or the, wait a moment, this just doesn't work, exists everywhere. And, you know, actually, I would say that Chinese food is not necessarily the main global victim of inauthentic manipulation. Historically, it is, because it's been around and manipulated for 140 years or so. At the moment, I would say globally Mexican food. What's called Tex-Mex in many countries that I've been to in Asia and Europe is dreadful and inauthentic. And so, you know, if I were from Mexico, I would either laugh or cry, depending on what kind of personality I had. So, you know, there are promising roads and there are unpromising roads for inauthenticity. There's innovation and there's just lowest common denominator, as we say, that is appealing. You figure out a formula that's cheap and people like it, and then you don't care about what you serve. One of the things about this movie that I mentioned, The Search for General Tso, is that they interviewed Chinese restaurant owners in Missouri, New Mexico, in the middle of the country, along the once famous Route 66, more or less. And some of them really want to educate their customers and want to bring them to food that is certainly closer to what they themselves eat, what they cook for their own families. And others are just happy. There's a whole passion for chicken with cashew nuts that's in Missouri. And, that's not authentic, and that doesn't appeal to me either. Undoubtedly, it's sweet. But, there's a certain exuberance that that is undeniable, even if it's not, my taste.
There's a trick you can play to make authentic, though. So I bring.
Well, that's what you guys are trying to do, right? That's one of your projects.
I bring the Dongbei dish like guobao to Americans, right? They think, wow, this is the best sweet sour pork they ever have, right? Those can be done in authentic ways, but only few. Like same thing, like you want to teach something, learn from university to elementary school, but there's some authentic kind of interesting experiment and display to make the kids very interested, as long as you make it easy. So the bandwidth understanding of where they are is very important for educators. So you don't want to bring those sea cucumbers, because nobody understands sea cucumbers in America. Nobody eat it. They will, even if you pay for them, you pay them to eat it, they won't do it because they think that's disgusting. And then there's no way to understand what's all nuance behind it, the sea cucumbers. So then, you have to come back to pork, sweet pork sometimes. And also like, basadi gua, like sweet, caramelized the sweet potatoes. They think that's like the best dish they ever have. So it's a simple dish. So I went to my colleague, they're typical Americans, to China to have a visit, to taste different kind of food. The way I go through the menu is like, I go reverse it. So because in the Chinese menu is all the big and those kind of big famous signature dishes all in front, and there's like the small stuff in the end. But when to Americans, if you reverse it, and those the small stuff in the end is always most appealing to them. It's simple, easy tasting. It always tastes very good as well. All the front part of that is always for them. Maybe I'll try it. I'll try one. It's okay. They won't try again sometimes.
Paul, it reminds me of the potato salad we had at that one restaurant in Beijing.
But during my trip to China, after a week or so, I realized that we were served all these different dishes all the time, and that the ones that resembled what I was familiar with, I mean, I loved the idea of experimentation, but, I realized that, gosh, I've actually helped myself to the twice cooked pork 4 times. And I left the scary seahorses just for one taste. So one is formed, however sophisticated one thinks they are. You're formed by your culture.
Yeah.
I will add another note on authenticity. That's, I think, pretty interesting, is if you've traveled in China, you'll notice that like different regions in China obviously have very different ideas of what certain dishes look like, right? So even in China, like Sichuan food in Beijing is not very authentic sometimes. Like it doesn't taste like it does in Sichuan, right? So China is a huge place, and there are places within China that don't have authentic regional foods, right? So it's not really that surprising that once you've moved to another location, even within China, things don't taste quite the way they do from where they're from, even if they're made by people who are from that area, right? And so when we talk about authenticity,
this happens in so many countries. Exactly. My work as a medievalist is mostly, as you said, in northeastern Spain and Catalonia. And there are 2 dishes that everybody eats all the time. One is extremely simple. It's bread toasted or grilled, preferably, with tomatoes smeared on it and olive oil. And it just doesn't taste right outside of Catalonia. Even in like other parts of Spain, even in Aragon, like across the river, it's not quite right. And then there's a kind of pastry made with sweetened spaghetti squash called ensaimada. And this is a specialty of Mallorca, the island of Mallorca. And in Barcelona, it doesn't taste right. And I can taste the difference. And I'm not actually a person with a particularly a well-developed food memory or palate. But, you know, so is it the water? Is it, these are things with very few ingredients, but nevertheless, somehow outside of their home territory, narrowly defined, don't quite work.
Right. And I guess one final nuance about authenticity. I mean, tomatoes are from the Americas, right? So like, you know, pan con you could say is inauthentic Spanish food because, you know, it
Right. They
wasn't
haven't had palm tomaca for more than 100, 150 years. Right.
Yeah.
And
Chili pepper.
chilies are from South America as well, right? So like,
yeah.
Imagine Sichuan food with no chili peppers, or Korean food with no chili peppers, right? Like those were inauthentic.
Or Indian food with no chili peppers. Right.
Exactly. Right. So as of 300 years ago, those would have been inauthentic too.
Somebody in Western Gujarat said, "Are you kidding? What this is? This isn't how my grandmother cooked."
Right.
And you know, it's like 1600 AD. Yeah.
All right. Okay, I think we're approaching the end of our time. I guess there are a couple of questions left, but I guess any last words from both of you? I thank you guys both for a fascinating conversation.
Oh, well, thank you. And, you know, I'd be glad to hear from you if you have questions that we haven't gotten around to. My email is on the Yale History Department website.
I want to show one picture I have with Cecilia. I think I can show that. So this is a picture of Cecilia after the celebration of her legacy in the P.F. Chang restaurant. She took us to Thai food places, and Paul, you were there, right?
I can't remember if I was at the after party.
Yeah, it's after the party, like eating crickets. So Cecilia is the kind of person who eat this, right? Like eat anything. So that's interesting. And then I think when people ask about my one sentence when Cecilia passed, I think Cecilia is the most optimistic person in the most like pathetic time of Chinese culture at that moment. Because China is like, at the moment we just leave the China Inclusion Act. Everyone is like Chinese people in the Chinese community. They're living a poor life. A lot of gangsters. So Cecilia is like trying to become a decent person and do a decent business. So different, and she make that everything happens. I think that spirit is something we really can inherit from all the years about cultural communication, being optimistic, proactive, want to teach people, always want to help people is very, very important. So yeah, that's one thing I think from today's event. One really from the legacy of Cecilia is more about this kind of this passionate optimism about the future.
Thank you for sharing that. That's great. All right, thank you everybody. I know there were a couple questions we didn't quite get to, but thank you both, Zhao and Paul, for joining us this
Thank
evening.
you. It's a wonderful time.
I will shoot my WeChat to the channel. So if you want, you can talk to me there.
Sure. Yeah. So Paul has mentioned, you know, you can look up his email on the Yale website, and that is Zhao Yong's.
Here it is.
There you go.
Yeah, my email is also very simple if you want that as well.
All right. Thank you guys so much. We look forward to more conversations as you guys, some of you have been joining us pretty regularly, so very wide-ranging topics. And as always, let us know if there are topics that you'd be interested in hearing more about. All right. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening and a good rest of the day to those of you guys in China.